Behold, I hold the sacred egg of Tuku. That means I should be the rightful ruler of this entire world, for whomever holds the egg of Tuku is the one who will get to decree the future of our people. For the egg knows, damn it, it knows. That stupid sword that you found in the lake the other day, how could it possibly know who should be leader? I wasn't chosen, and clearly I have been chosen by the egg of Tuku. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Campaign Creator. We're talking about forms of government and all of the implications that go with government. Now, what does this have to do with our campaign, you ask? Well, this is all part of our setting, and we need to do a little bit of setup in terms of our setting before we can really move forward with our adventure planning. If we want the two to feel integrated, if we don't want them to feel integrated, we can then finish off our adventure planning. We're going to come back. I, however, like to do a bit of a mix-up because inspiration can come from the most amazing places, and oftentimes you kind of go, oh, I don't feel like doing adventures today. I'm going to go do a map. Or you feel about, no, let me develop an idea or of a culture. The muse will take us in whatever direction we might be, and I've noticed comments on this video series where people say, oh, I don't start like that. I go with this, I get an idea for that, I use geology, or whatever your inspiration might be. The idea, though, is that we need to have these things at our disposal, and so each of these videos, again, as I have said before, I'm hoping you are following along using those bullet points, timestamps to jump between the topics, but also to develop as you watch the video. So when we talk forms of government, what are the implications to our characters and to our plot? What are the implications? And that is ultimately the bottom line. Now, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg. If we create the governments first, do the plots come out of that? Yes. If we create the plots first, do the governments come out of that? Yes. As we need governments to support the plot, we need the plot to support the governments, etc., etc. So it's a cycle, and there's no real right way or wrong way to start. The idea is that if you create a dictatorship where you have this ruler who has somehow seized power and they are simply dominating, it's a very dark environment for the player characters to exist in. You've got to answer questions like, well, if there is a dictatorship, how militant are they going to be? And if they are very militant, what can the players do to mitigate that? Is there a way that the players can figure out, okay, I don't really want to live there. And if that's the kingdom that your characters are going to be predominantly roaming around, is it one that they really want to play in? It's all good and well saying, okay, well, this campaign is set in Nazi Germany during World War I, or during World War II, I should say. Okay, that's a very difficult space to be in. In the early years, you've got this amazing sense of community and camaraderie and socialist building. In the second half, you have this desperate struggle to accept that the dream is actually a nightmare and that what was being done was complete and utter mind control. So it's a very complicated space to play in. Is it something that your players want to participate in? Well, it might be. It might not be as well. So I like to create worlds that have got different types of political entities governing and controlling them, and that allows us to explore different options that if our players don't like the environment they find themselves in, they can move on and find another one elsewhere. Now, we are going to look at the different forms of government, and we're going to unpack how each of those governments affects the player groups and can be used. Now, obviously, when one does look at the different types of governments, there are so many of them. I started to put titles up, and I was like, this is just going to be a list. This is going to be a spectacularly long list, and it's not going to work. So when we look at different types of governments, there's a few that spring to mind, and there are different ways in which we can express them. And since we have a fantastical environment, whether it's science fiction or whether it is fantasy or anything along those lines, we have to add in a few things that don't exist in the real world. So we turn to beg your pardon, we turn to the real world to see what we have available. We've got dominion, which is basically almost like an empire, but there is a certain independence to how each colony, how each environment works within that space, but they are all subservient to dominion. Dominions are very interesting things, generally speaking. So there's a dominion. There's a chiefdom, which is a small space. It doesn't necessarily even count itself as a country, but you might have multiple chiefdoms within a territory. And that territory is perhaps a bunch of orcs with their chiefdoms. They don't collectively work together, but they also don't collectively work against one another. And if a new chiefdom tries to emerge, if a new chief tries to come to power, they're going to have to fight for their space within that territory. You have federations, confederations, there's empires, hegemonies, democracies obviously come to mind, oligarchies, aristocracies, plutarchies, caterarchies. I'm just looking at the list here. Some very interesting ones. Technocracy, technocracy, I don't know how you want to pronounce that. Meritocracy. I fell in love with the meritocracy because I think that's what we should have. Meritocracy. And you go, well, what the hell is a meritocracy? A meritocracy is the leader is selected because they are deemed to be the most appropriate person to run the country. There is a vetting process. They have enough merit to run the country. They are not voted for. They are calculated out. This is the person who is best designed to service us. In a science fiction environment, it could very well be a genetically engineered or enhanced individual. It could be an AI that runs the entire thing. So meritocracy is something that I fell in love with. We can have a magocracy. Some people call it a magocracy or an arcanocracy. An arcanocracy is where the most powerful wizard or the most powerful spellcaster rules. You can have a dictatorship, obviously. You can have a kleptocracy, where the leadership just plunders everything from those that live there. Kleptomania, stealing things, they steal from the populations. A monarchy versus a republic. So is there a voting system? How do we get people into power? Tribalism, so we've got lots of little tribes. We've got feudalism, so there's a very clear distinction. Do we have a caste system? Is it socialism? Is it communism? Is it totalitarianism? How does it work? How are we representing our different groups? And you can go and unpack each and every one of those. That's not what we're going to be talking about today. So there's this really long list of different things, and each one comes with its own requirements. I always go back and say, okay, what is the effect going to be on my players and on their characters? So if we just take a few here, let's look at the meritocracy. So meritocracy, the most appropriately skilled individual is placed in power. Meritocracy by default then implies that everybody who then fulfills an office, who fulfills a space within that meritocracy, would be equally as qualified for that particular position. Your sheriff will be hired because they are a particularly good sheriff. They may be good at making social calls, they're good at tracking people, they're good at enforcing the law. What are the fundamentals that would make up a good sheriff? As an environment for the characters to then go into and explore, but it does become quite difficult. They're not going to get the stupid blacksmith. They will get a very competent blacksmith. Why? Well, because that's what you're designed for. You're a perfect blacksmith. You are a very bad this or a very bad that. Gattaca looked at it from a genetic perspective, the movie. You are genetically predisposed to being an artist. So I'm afraid that's what you are. You are an artist. You're a very good artist. Off you go, be art, and do art stuff. You are definitely a lawyer. You're a lawyer through and through. So off you go, do the law. So a meritocracy from a player perspective, they're going to enter into this country, which is actually fairly well run. On paper, anyway, that's how meritocracy works. The most qualified individual gets the role. In practice, you might find that the most qualified person who applied for the position got the role. So there's a certain degradation that starts to happen. All systems do have that. We have to bear that in mind. The players now are going to encounter competent individuals. They're going to encounter individuals who are very fixed in their ways. They might, as a matter of fact, need to encounter what the meritocracy is going to do with a bunch of technically unemployed adventurers. There's that running joke that that's really what an adventurer is. I'm an adventurer. Oh, so you are homeless, unemployed, and prone to murder, and your morals are highly questionable. Basically, you're a sellsword. You will work for coin. And you're coming into our country, our very well-run country. What qualifications do you have to be homeless, unemployed, and an adventurer? It does pose some very interesting questions. The meritocracy might very well say, come in, come in, come in. You claim to be an adventurer. That's perfect. Your skill set includes monster hunting. Check. Right. Entering into dangerously ancient and potentially structurally unsound areas. Check. Yes. And all that you require in payment is whatever has been abandoned in those said structures or by those monsters. Yes, check. Great. We've got some problems in our country and no one really qualifies because they're not expendable. You, however, check all the boxes. No one will know if you disappear. No one will care if you don't come back. You have no property that requires your attention. So yes, you are absolutely the most qualified individuals to go off in this area. I like that, and immediately it starts to give me adventure ideas. The meritocracy is going to be awfully polite and awfully wonderful until they find out that they can use you for something that they don't want to use their own people for. Well, why sacrifice our people? We're better skilled than anybody else. We are perfect for our jobs. You are not. You're foreigners here. Unless they already start in that place, in which case then the player character's questions, why are you leaving your designated occupation? If the player's character is older than the age of work, they will have been assigned a position or they will have adopted a position. They will need to account for why they're suddenly leaving. What's the change in attitude? That's not to say that meritocracies don't come with issues and that don't run very well. So there is definitely that focus in that space where it's about challenge, it's about standards. What type of country would a meritocracy then be? I believe it would be a country that's obsessed with basically getting skills and acquiring skills. Well, you know you can only advance if you get your level 5 blacksmithing. You're only a level 4 blacksmith. That means you can't service more than 150 people. No. You're going to go and get those merits at the next blacksmith's convocation so that you can then start to charge more for your equipment and armor because you're a higher level blacksmith. That certainly buys into the idea that we have a level-based system in a lot of the role-playing systems that we play. On the other hand, it creates a people who are very dedicated to getting more qualifications so that they can get a higher salary and a higher wage. That's very competitive. So now we can start to add in characters who are trying to compete with the PCs. You're adventurers. I'm also an adventurer. I'm more qualified as an adventurer than you are, and I'm going to prove it. I'm going to beat you. Anyway, these are just ideas that come to mind when I look at things and I go, okay, so that's a potential for a meritocracy. Let's twist it around now. Let's go and look at, let's say, let me choose an interesting one here. An Anocracy. An Anocracy is where it's part democracy, part dictatorship. So there is dictatorship, there's democratic voting that goes on, but then a single voice gets to basically decide. So this is what you're all thinking, and that one is the one that we're going with. It's a very interesting approach, and it has been proposed as being like, this is the best way to run humanity. We got lots of decision, lots of options coming in, and then someone takes all of those options and decides accordingly. Yes, it can be obviously abused quite heavily. And if you look at the Roman people, that's what they tried to achieve to a degree with the idea of the Senate, where everyone was represented at the Senate. And then you had the two praetors who would then sit in judgment, listen, and then make the final decision-making process, right up until Julius arrived and said, right, enough of that, we're going to change the system. So it can work. It could be interesting. You have a democratic space, and then you have a final arbiter. I imagine that what that could spawn, and again, I'm pushing these things to the extremes, it could spawn that you have these groups of people who go around and a crime is committed. A group of people get together to decide on the outcome of the crime, and then there is a final judge who weighs in heavily upon that. It's almost like a jury system where the judge can then decide against it. So it's an interesting approach. Now imagine if you had this government that was busy operating, but instead of every town being represented, it would be a little bit more efficient if you, say, had a group of 12 people who would be dressed in a very specific thing. And this weird image came into my mind of these long light blue cloaks with these white beak-like masks that the characters would wear. If they are impassive, they are neutral, they are the representatives, and they move around the country, and they get to debates, they host these public debates and things, they listen to what's going on, and then they make the call. So the central government obviously still operates and still runs, but they are making a central call. They are deciding for the village, should we plant wheat or potatoes? The 12 will then listen to all of the debates and the arguments that go on, and then they will decide, we are planting potatoes. No one can go against it, no one can violate it, the decision has been made, it is the will of the collective in this really weird space. So that's an Anocracy. I think it's an interesting space to explore. Again, adventures pop out in terms of how are the PCs going to encounter that. If the PCs commit a law, if they commit a crime within the law, these blue-cloaked, white-beaked individuals are going to arrive, and they're going to have to defend themselves. It does mean, and I think that this could work quite interestingly, and I know this is not how it's supposed to work here on Earth, but we're in a role-playing environment. If you can persuade 7 out of those 14 individuals or 7 out of the 12 individuals that you are innocent, you get to go innocent. They make the decision. So facts and data is not particularly important. It's about how you can convince those 7 masked individuals that you are correct. So I think that's probably how it would work. Now, I know I sound like I'm always trying to find the fault within these different types of systems, and that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Evil arises when there is a weakness. It will find that weakness, it will utilize, and it will capitalize on those weaknesses. So it's very, very, very easy to then say, okay, great, let's look at a monarchy. The king. The king, how is the king replaced? When the king dies, does the queen take over? Does she have to become a male? Does she have to become a male? This happened in Egyptian history. When Hatshepsut took power, she was a female pharaoh, but they couldn't abide that idea, so she was still made to look like a male pharaoh, and she still had to wear the pharaonic beard that gave her power, even though she was a woman. And she was particularly vindictive against her children too, erasing her son from history, because she was worried he was going to try and take the throne from her, and then vice versa, and all sorts of things happen. So when you have a monarchy, it doesn't really matter. Whenever you have a system of government, something that you have to take into consideration is lineage, how and title. How does it pass from one to the other? In a meritocracy, it's very simple. Your father was a blacksmith, but you're useless. You can't inherit his title. Your father used to be the administrator of this sector. He was a good administrator. You can't even read. You're best suited for manual labor. Off you go, masonry work. Thank you. Next. So you need to put that into position and perspective as well. Oftentimes assassinations, whether that's a character assassination or an actual physical body assassination, will cause the king to now his son or his daughter or the uncle. You have to look at those things when you're deciding on the political body that you're choosing for your kingdom. The other thing that we need to bear in mind is that you might say, okay, well, let's say that let's try a parliamentary system. Okay, great. A parliamentary system kind of works. I come from a country that uses a parliamentary system. The parliamentary system talks about separation of powers, so that there's no one power that's more powerful than the other, and it's representation to a degree of the elected, by the elected individuals, and there's more to it than that, of course. The challenge with a parliamentary system is that all the parliamentarians need to get together on a regular basis. When you are dealing with a science fiction type environment, they can hologram in and they can be part of those meetings. Perhaps. If you're out in the void, if you're dealing with something where there is a lot of space and maybe the communications isn't that instantaneous, how then does it work? Maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. Most likely it won't work. The idea of the Senate in the Star Wars, where all the senators continuously get back together again, it works because they have real-time communications back home. If you're going with a more realistic approach and you say, well, actually messages take 3 months to move from point A to point B, so Princess Amidala would only know 3 months after the invasion of Naboo that she needs to go to the Senate, and then it would take her 3 months to get there, and then 3 months to book her reservation, So you have to unpack it and say, okay, well, is this actually going to work for the environment? And would a parliament work in a fantasy environment? Well, perhaps I can see a bunch of orcs getting together every week to decide on the running of their nation because they can do so at their capital. Yes, we can certainly do that. That kind of works. How do they get out to their constituents? Well, unfortunately, in modern day parliamentary situations, it doesn't really work anyway. And that's with modern day communications and transportation. So in a fantasy environment, if your speed of transport is the speed of a horse or the speed of a wagon, getting messaging out is a major limiting factor. The Zulu Empire, or the Zulu Kingdom, it was never an empire, the Zulu Kingdom, the idea was that it could only stretch as far as a man could run in a day. They didn't have horses back then, and well, there was just no equitable breed at the time in southern Africa. So a man could run for a day, maybe 2 days, maybe 3 days. That's as far as the empire could be. Beyond that, there was really no way to control how the outside fringes were going to be working, and that frequently caused issues. If you look at the Romans, the entire reason why we say all roads lead to Rome is for the specific reason of getting messaging out to the outlying territories and moving troops along those roads. So transportation, and this is why we looked at it so early on, is a vital aspect of designing your campaign because it determines what kind of governments can be in power. There's no point being a dictator if no one can hear your dictates, your dictoriums, your mandates, your issuances. All of these things should weigh in as you try and design each and every kingdom. And I'm going to show you in another video later on the breakdown that I have done of the different kingdoms and the various different types of government that are present. Another thing to bear in mind, of course, in our instances, it's fairly, I don't want to say straightforward, but it is something to look at, is to say, well, culturally, the creatures that live within those territories, what type of government have they formed? Is it dictatorships? Is that something that they're used to? Is it strength, the strongest rule? We achieved these Amazonian states where we have it's a matriarchy, and so it's women who lead and men cannot lead whatsoever. We can explore all of these ideas and add them to our campaign world to make it really, really, really interesting. I hope this video has been insightful, at least in terms of getting you to the next level in terms of designing your politics and your kingdoms. I couldn't do this in the usual way where I go around the map designing all of these different kingdoms and talking about it, because it is a lengthy process if you want to talk about a lot of different countries. If you want to talk about a lot of different kingdoms, each one needs to be thought out of, each one needs to be plotted out and planned. That's something you can do in your own time. What you can do is immediately you can create your own little geographic map for the territory that the characters are going to start in if they're all starting in the same country. If their backstories are similar, if they all grew up in the same country, so they're not a collection of different races. Even different races, that's fine if it's all from the same country, from the same territory. There's no reason to say that orcs all have to come from wherever the orcs come from in your world. There are pockets of orcs all over the place, quite possibly. So they're from this particular orcish group that happens to be within the single kingdom. So when you do that, that then allows you to create smaller chunks of map, if you so choose, and to control those spaces a lot better. So when you then look at this map, which I'm now presenting to you on screen, this is Utherios and Throselios, our two kingdoms. Throselios is a meritocracy, because I really like that idea. I think because I also base these two on a sort of a Spartan, Greco-Romany type of environment, that sort of ancient Greece space. Throselikos, Throselios, I should say, being the Spartan-esque type of thing. The Spartans were all about being the best. So meritocracy for me kind of makes sense. That's not the system that they had. They had two kings which were responsible for running the country, and those kings were elected from their group. So I suppose it was a meritocracy to a degree. Nonetheless, that is Throselikos, the smaller little country in the north of the map. The bulk of the map is the Eutherios, and I went with a hegemony. Now, a hegemony, I've heard it pronounced so many different ways, but hegemony is how I pronounce it, is pretty much what they had in ancient Greece. So it wasn't me being particularly insightful, but I like the idea that you have these independent little spaces. So each of the big cities are there. They're all used, and well, obviously they're all used, but they're all independent of each other. But they've signed up to the hegemony of the Therios, so that there is a single body responsible for maintaining Eutherios as an entity, maintaining a standing army, crops for the entire country, balancing out of the resources that are available, but each individual city is still governed by the local people, if you like. So Pytherians, who are from Pythios, they can still choose their own internal conduct laws, they can choose their own values and their own systems, as well as bowing down to the Eutherios hegemony. Now, when we look at our original campaign plan, we had Jakar invading Eutherios or invading Uther at the time, the lands of Uther, the kingdom of Uther. We had her invading because she wants the dragon eggs. Great stuff. That's superb. If each of the major cities that form the hegemony of Eutherios each have a dragon egg, well, now we start to see some plot options coming through, which I think is absolutely fantastic. She doesn't have to hit one city, she has to hit all of the cities. Because the moment she hits the first city and she goes after the egg, the rest will know and they will fly and hide those eggs away. So she's got to do this spectacular simultaneous invasion of, I think it's 4 big cities. We've got Gypthos, we've got Pytherios, we've got Zolos, and we've got Defini. The 4 major components of the hegemony. There are other towns, of course, as well that contribute, but those are the 4 big ones. So if there's 4 dragon eggs, I'm going to have to hit them at the same time. So again, it does not change my primary plot. It enhances it. It makes it much more interesting. I now also have 4 cities, well, I've got a whole lot of cities as a matter of fact, who each one could have a slight variation on a theme. This one could be a patriarchy, this one could be a matriarchy, this one could be an oligarchy, this one could be a theocracy. Definii definitely would be a theocracy. We look at the cults that we created, the life cult, the blood cult, etc., etc. Maybe each of the cities embraces one of those cults. Now, we said that the cults were not exclusionary. You didn't have to worship just one cult. But the idea of all of the life cultists getting together at Zolos to enhance the environment that's around them. Zolos is in the Barons' territory. So, Baron, very little life. Life cult is there because the journey, the experience of these trackless deserts, they're not empty. They are full of life. You just have to be aware of it. You have to go out and experience it. I could see the cults kind of being in there. And if that's the case, then you look at the cult alignment and you go, well, maybe the life cult, I think, is not so much about, let's say, a democracy, because nature is not about democracy. Life is about experience. So perhaps it's more of a representational community, or maybe it's a dictatorship. The life cult just dictates how the city should experience in life. I don't think that sounds crazy. Maybe it's a city that doesn't have a central rulership. Maybe each street is controlled by different gangs. That's an interesting emergence. Trying to pair up what these different cities have is interesting. By choosing a hegemony to begin with, it's led us down this rabbit path of, wow, okay, so this city, the city of Zolos, is actually, each block is run by individual leaders, individual chiefdoms, if you like, within the city, who all worship the life cult and who, as a city, are part of the hegemony. I think it's very interesting. Very, very interesting. So those are some thoughts of mine, anyway, on how one approaches the political side of things. And by adding it in at this stage of the game, at this stage of our planning, it can start to influence our plots, and it can give us some inspiration as to moving forward. Having all of this at our fingertips means that when we start getting to our plotting stage, we're going to have just that much more fun. Anyway, until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of campaign creation. So, I like the egg, but my wife subscribed to making it for breakfast, so I might just have to say that maybe the egg of Tuku is not going to determine this year's leader. I think that we should just ring the Goblin Bell, and whoever hears it first is the leader. I think that would be fair. Huh? We can all leave the city and wait, and then when we hear the bell, we run into the city, and we the first person to get to the bell wins, except for the person who rang the bell in the first place. They are automatically disqualified. So we're just going to choose Fat Pete. You can't rule the country, so you're going to ring the bell. That's fair.